For years, Vladimir Putin has used Kaliningrad to threaten NATO nations, with a particular focus on the Baltic. And why wouldn't he? The exclave sits in an awkward location between Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic Sea. That would make it a perfect launching point for a sneaky invasion into NATO territory. NATO knows this, and now it's had enough. Putin's worst nightmare has come true as NATO has started treating Kaliningrad like an active war zone rather than a potential threat. The message has been sent to Russia's leader: use Kaliningrad at your peril, because HIMARS are locked on and ready to fire. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which reported on August 4th that Putin has a serious problem emerging in Kaliningrad. NATO is no longer treating the exclave like a passive threat, as it has in the past. Everything that is happening in Kaliningrad is being studied and tracked, all while Russia's NATO neighbors are quietly preparing for a situation that some in NATO believe is more of an inevitability than a possibility: Putin starting a war with a NATO nation. Estonia could be one of the countries that Putin targets if he decides to use Kaliningrad as the launching point for an invasion. And it is to Estonia that we go to see how NATO is preparing to use its HIMARS. Euromaidan Press reports that Estonia has just completed its first ever live-fire drills using the powerful US-made HIMARS multiple rocket launcher. The country's HIMARS purchase is part of a 6-unit acquisition plan as Estonia beefs up its border defenses while gaining the offensive capability to hit Kaliningrad hard should the need ever arise. With HIMARS, Estonia gets its hands on a weapon with a range of up to 186 miles. Depending on the type of projectile used. While that isn't a long enough range for Estonia to hit Kaliningrad from its own territory, that isn't the point. If war breaks out, Estonia will be able to move its HIMARS units through Latvia and into Lithuania, allowing it to hit Kaliningrad from the country that directly borders the exclave. If there was any doubt about the focus of Estonia's drills, its simulated targets dispel those doubts. Fortified bunkers, hardened positions, missile launch pads, all were simulated targets Estonia used in its drills, and all are types of assets that have been built up in Kaliningrad over the decades, Euromaidan Press reports. This is far from the first thing Estonia has done in recent months to show Putin that it's ready to tackle the Kaliningrad problem. In July, the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service reported that Estonia had welcomed soldiers from the US Army's Bravo battery onto its territory. Those soldiers were there for training purposes. They oversaw the first live fire of a HIMARS system inside Estonia, advising and observing as Estonia learned how to use the weapon. At the time, US Army Staff Sergeant and Bravo Battery Advisor Skylar Rosecrans highlighted how important a step this was. It's pretty significant because this is the first HIMARS live fire they've done, and it's going to allow them to be qualified and have all their crews certified, Rosecrans said. It's great seeing their level of excitement and how prepared they want to be and the pride they have in this kind of mission. This exercise was a precursor to what we saw in August. July was the month that Estonia welcomed HIMARS into the country and conducted some live fires under US supervision. August marked the first time that it completed a live fire exercise on its own. Worse yet for Putin, it wasn't just HIMARS that Estonia trained with. Defense Industry Europe reported that the British Army was also present in Estonia during the live fire exercises as part of a multinational battle group. There, the UK tested out the Archer artillery systems it's recently deployed to Estonia. Those systems have a 155mm gun that is transported using a 6-wheeled truck, and they allow Estonia to pack even more of a firepower punch with artillery that can hit targets up to 31 miles away. HIMARS and Archers. Putin should be shaking in his boots because he knows that both weapons could cause serious damage to Kaliningrad. Russia's leader will be even more terrified by the fact that these live-fire exercises now mean that Kaliningrad is surrounded by HIMARS. Beyond the weapons Estonia now has, which could be transported into Lithuania if they're needed, Poland also has HIMARS pointing at Kaliningrad. That's according to Newsweek, which reported in March 2023 that NATO was moving to position HIMARS with the Polish Army's 16th Mechanized Division until the end of 2023. Kaliningrad is being threatened from both sides. If Putin tries anything, they'll rain rockets down on his precious exclave. Still, Russia's leader might have thought to himself NATO might be preparing for a fight with Kaliningrad, but that doesn't mean it'll know when that fight will start. The exclave is infamously secretive, and Putin rarely gives much away in terms of how he's planning to use this small patch of territory that is separated from the Russian mainland. That secretive nature might be enough for Putin to get the jump on his NATO enemies by using Kaliningrad to strike first, rendering the HIMARS in Estonia and Poland useless. That's what Putin will hope, but those hopes are already dashed. NATO is already working to ensure that nothing happening in Kaliningrad escapes the collective defense organization's attention. Beyond the HIMARS being focused on the exclave, NATO is sending eyes in the skies to watch everything that is going on inside Kaliningrad. NATO AWACS surveillance aircraft have begun continuous flights over Poland and the Baltic Sea to monitor Kaliningrad's military activity. Euromaidan Press reported on August 4th. The news broke that NATO was deploying its Airborne Warning and Control System or AWACS aircraft around Kaliningrad a few days earlier, thanks to a July 26th Business Insider report that saw a member of the outlet's team embed themselves with a NATO-operated E-3A Sentry unit, as it took part in an 8-hour flight that saw it observing Kaliningrad and the Baltic Sea from a height of 30,000 feet. These are NATO's eyes in the skies. Business Insider's report writes about watching an aircraft console covered in blinking triangles and U-shapes, each marking a ship, jet, or some other object that was moving either in the Baltic Sea or inside Kaliningrad itself. The article quotes a US Air Force officer named only as Major Ben, who says, "Being up at 30,000 feet, we can look down and we can see pretty much everything on the ground." It's these powers of observation that will terrify Putin. Kaliningrad is no longer the secretive exclave it always had been in the past. In truth, NATO could have been watching it for far longer than it has been. The E-3As being used to track what's happening in Kaliningrad now have been around since the 1980s, so the capability has always been there. But years ago there was no real reason to keep eyes on Kaliningrad. Putin's Ukraine invasion changed all that. Today, Kaliningrad is seen as a potential powder keg that could ignite into a full-blown war between NATO and Russia. The exclave is being tracked constantly, with every object and radar pulse emanating from Kaliningrad now being on NATO's radar. Of course, this brings us to the obvious question: why has NATO chosen now to place such a heavy emphasis on Kaliningrad? There are a few reasons, starting with the cyberattacks and political meddling that seem to be emanating from the exclave. Euromaidan Press says that these types of issues have surged across the Baltic states in recent months. Estonia is flagging hacks on its state infrastructure. In Latvia, groups with links to Russia are funding political rallies in an attempt to strengthen Putin's waning influence in the country. And in Lithuania, GPS spoofing on commercial aircraft is putting planes that fly over the country's airspace at risk. This spate of attacks is just the tip of the Russian hybrid iceberg. Instic Media noted in June that Russia's cyber assaults on the Baltic states are far from new occurrences. As far back as 2017, Estonia's former president Toomas Hendrik Ilves was pointing out the cyber influence Putin was attempting to wield. "You don't have to hack the power grid, let alone attack with a division of tanks, if you can hack the elections and change the policies of a country," Hendrik told the Atlantic Council over 5 years before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. The Baltics have always been a target of Russia's aggression. Putin just used the net instead of tanks to hurt the three countries. Kaliningrad plays a key role in many of these cyber attacks. It's perfectly positioned to hit Poland and the Baltic states, thanks to being sandwiched between those territories. So much so that Canada's Macdonald Laurier Institute dubbed the exclave "a dagger aimed at the heart of Europe" in a July 2024 article. It points out that Kaliningrad has seemingly returned to the posture it held during the Cold War, when it was used by Russia to serve as a constant threat to Europe, much as it's being used today. The Macdonald Laurier Institute also points to several instances of cyber attacks being linked to the exclave, including one incident in April 2024 when a pair of passenger jets were forced to turn around in mid-flight thanks to GPS jamming occurring close to Kaliningrad. It's this type of jamming, along with the spoofing we mentioned earlier, that is now causing chaos in the Baltic airspace, as well as creating problems for ships in the Baltic Sea. On the political side of things, we mentioned earlier that political groups funded by Putin are arranging pro-Russian demonstrations in the country. The odds are high that the required funds are reaching those groups by way of Kaliningrad. Lithuania also isn't immune from Putin's political machinations. In March 2024, LRT reported that a train traveling between Moscow and Kaliningrad was stopped because it was laden with unauthorized inscriptions that were seemingly designed to stir up pro-Russian sentiment. One of those inscriptions read, "Vilnius, a Russian city." We say inscriptions, it was more crude graffiti on the side of the train. But even such seemingly tiny actions like these are all part of a grand Russian plan to whip up pro-Russian sentiment while disrupting the Baltic nations. It's all hybrid warfare, from its most technologically advanced to its most basic, and Kaliningrad is at the center of it all. These are not isolated provocations, Euromaidan Press writes. They mirror the early warning signs that preceded Russia's invasions of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in both 2014 and 2022. The pattern is familiar, and its central node is Kaliningrad. Nearly every signal jamming incident, radar incursion, or drone probe in the region traces back to the Russian exclave, making it the catalyst for any new escalation. Escalation that NATO wants to get ahead of with its spy planes and HIMARS deployments. But it's not just cyber-attacking and political gamesmanship that make Kaliningrad such a problem for NATO. The exclave also represents a far more direct threat, thanks to its history of being used by Russia as what amounts to a massive storage unit for some of the country's most dangerous weapons and soldiers. And Putin has given NATO plenty of reasons to be wary of Kaliningrad since he launched his Ukraine invasion. Back in August 2022, Al Jazeera reported that the Russian military had transferred some of its warplanes, including a trio of MiG-31 fighter jets, to Kaliningrad. That alone wouldn't be too much to worry about. NATO has plenty of aerial firepower to deal with these jets alone. However, far more worrying was Russia's claim that it had loaded those jets with brand new Kinzhal hypersonic missile. These missiles reportedly travel at speeds up to 10 times the speed of sound and have a range of 1,250 miles, placing the Baltic states, Poland, and much of Europe under threat. Fast forward to June 2024 and Russia was at it again. At least that was according to former Polish Foreign Minister and now Deputy Prime Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. The Kyiv Independent says that the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Berlin saw Sikorski claim that Russia may be storing as many as 100 nuclear warheads in Kaliningrad, meaning that an attack on the European Union is quite likely. This may have been scaremongering to some extent, but it again highlights that Kaliningrad is far more than a basic Russian exclave. It's a threat, and one that may be developing into a Russian fortress. CNA notes that beyond the hypersonic missiles, planes, and nukes, Kaliningrad was home to up to 18,000 Russian troops as of 2021. It's also protected by 4 battalions of S-400 air defense systems and offers a port for the 52-ship-strong Baltic fleet. Putin, though secretive about how he intends to use Kaliningrad in the future, is making no secret of the fact that he wants the exclave to be a threat to NATO. And it's a threat that many in the West recognize. That includes US Army Europe and Africa Commander General Chris Donahue, who said in July that NATO would be capable of taking Kaliningrad in a time frame that is unheard of. The point here is that Kaliningrad represents as much of a direct military threat to NATO, and especially to the Baltic states, as it does a political and cyber threat. The exclave is clearly home to Russian weapons. How many, especially given Putin's Ukraine invasion, is still up for debate. But it's clear that Putin wants Kaliningrad to be ready for whatever Russia's leader may have planned. NATO's HIMARS and spy planes are being called into action now to help the collective defense organization understand precisely what it will be up against if a battle breaks out. That battle could be over the Sulki Gap. This 40-mile stretch of land links Poland and Lithuania, though it also lies between Kaliningrad and Belarus. The Lansing Institute says that it's the only land route NATO forces have to reach the Baltic states, which also means it's a key strategic location for Putin to target if he wants to isolate those states from the rest of NATO. Kaliningrad's proximity to the Sulki Gap makes it a near guarantee that Putin would use his exclave if he decided to take the scrap of territory. Such an attack would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Convention, prompting all 32 members of the Collective Defense Organization to go to war with Russia. But in the more immediate sense, Kaliningrad hitting the Sulki Gap could weaken NATO logistics around the Baltics, perhaps allowing Putin to conduct a flash invasion while NATO tries to get its collective act together. At least that would be Putin's plan, and the military buildup inside Kaliningrad may all be in service of that plan. All of these issues combine to turn Kaliningrad into what Euromaidan press dubs a battlefield node. In short, Kaliningrad is no longer just a base, it's a battlefield node already in use, Euromaidan press says. Now Europe is pushing back. NATO AWACS surveillance aircraft have begun continuous flights over Poland and the Baltic Sea to monitor Kaliningrad's military activity. That brings us back to Estonia and Poland's HIMARS, the NATO eyes in the sky, and everything else that NATO is doing that reveals it's treating Kaliningrad like an active war zone. What we see with all of these exercises is a hypothetical battle plan starting to form that would allow NATO to quickly remove Kaliningrad from the equation in a war with Russia, which in turn protects the Baltic nations and keeps the Sulki Gap under NATO control. That plan starts with the HIMARS. Now that Estonia and Poland both have them and know how to use them, these HIMARS could be used to target Kaliningrad's fixed missile sites, stripping away one of the key weapons the exclave has. That will prevent Russia from hitting the Baltics and Poland with missiles from the ground, including any nukes that may be in Kaliningrad. The hypersonic missiles Russia claims to have in the exclave present a different problem. They're launched from aircraft, meaning NATO would need to deploy its own fighters and bombers on suppression missions designed to take out Kaliningrad's air bases. Perhaps that's where the spy planes come into play. Their constant sorties reveal where these bases are, as well as providing a ton of data NATO can use to circumvent Russia's GPS jamming and other cyber attacks. NATO's naval forces would come into play with a Baltic Sea blockade, essentially trapping Russia's Baltic fleet inside that waterway while preventing any other Russian ships from joining it in attacks. The Sulki Gap, having been protected from the initial Kaliningrad missile onslaught, would be reinforced with ground troops that could also stream into Poland and the Baltics to attack the exclave from both sides. Those troops might even be in position before Putin launched an attack from Kaliningrad, again thanks to intelligence picked up by NATO's spy planes. This is the hypothetical scenario Euromaidan Press puts forth, based on what NATO is doing right now with its HIMARS units and observation of Kaliningrad. But it's an interesting potential roadmap, and it reinforces Donohue's comments about the likelihood of Kaliningrad falling quickly to a NATO assault. That is, assuming NATO gets the jump on Russia. And that's the whole point of what Estonia, Poland, and the rest of the Baltics and NATO as a whole are doing right now. The approach to Kaliningrad has changed. No longer passive, NATO is treating the exclave as though it's already a war zone. Granted, that doesn't mean we're going to see rockets flying and troops marching right now. But as soon as Putin shows even the slightest inclination to use Kaliningrad for what he seems to be preparing to use it for, NATO is ensuring that he do so with a message ringing in his ears. NATO is ready and waiting. Of course, it may not come to that. An interesting postscript to NATO's changing attitude toward Kaliningrad comes from a January 2025 article published by the Atlantic Council. Written months before NATO's stance on Kaliningrad changed, the article posited that Trump's outside-of-the-box approach to bringing peace to the Ukraine war might be the key to making Kaliningrad a non-factor before a fight could ever break out. The outlet points out that many of the troops that Putin previously stationed in Kaliningrad were moved into Ukraine once Putin launched his invasion. So the 18,000 we mentioned earlier may not be there anymore. That creates potential leverage for Trump. When, if, and how Russian troops will return to Kaliningrad could be a negotiation topic between the Trump administration, the EU, and NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other, the Atlantic Council says. Perhaps part of the peace negotiations could include Russia granting independence to Kaliningrad, making it a non-factor in any future war between Russia and NATO. Admittedly, that's a hard sell. Putin will have no interest in demilitarizing his valuable exclave, meaning the only chance of this alternative scenario happening is if Russia is losing the war in Ukraine to such a point that Putin is on the back foot at the negotiating table. That isn't the situation right now, and frankly, waiting for a future where that might happen isn't good enough. NATO needs to do something about Kaliningrad right now, even if there's a possibility to demilitarize it later. Still, it's an option. One of many that NATO has given itself now that HIMARS surround Kaliningrad on both sides and spy planes are flying around the exclave to watch every single move that Putin makes. NATO will be ready for whatever comes next. Can the same be said for Russia? While Putin ponders that question, he also has another problem to handle. It's not just the European members of NATO that's had enough of Russia. The US has reached its breaking point and has moved 2 nuclear submarines into strike positions. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the ongoing fight between NATO and Russia. And thank you for watching.